As a type designer and occasionally as a graphic designer, I spent my weekdays mostly drawing letters and sometimes also using letters. So today I would love to share a few letter stories from my type design practice, as well as some results of my type-related research. I'll be talking about what nourishes the letters until they grow into their final form. And it's pretty much everything in this world, but today I will focus on a limited amount of phenomena, and it will be retrofuturism, self-imposed rules, real historical events, as well as some alternative history. I will start with an extended story of my condensed type family called Pilot. It was released by a Dutch type foundry, Bold Monday, in 2017. And since Pilot came out, I occasionally feed my ego by reading what other people have to say about it. And there is quite a wide range of assumptions what Pilot was influenced by. As you can see, people mention sign painter lettering, black letter, and even German expressionism. And while all these assumptions are totally adequate and valid, I must say that none of those things were on my mind when I actually designed Pilot, when I worked on Pilot, when it was conceived. So it was conceived when I was getting my master's degree in type design at the Typemedia course in The Hague. And one of the repeating assignments during the course was to draw a few letters with randomly chosen parameters like a sender and descender height, weight, width, and many more, depending on how brave the student was. And those parameters were generated by a tool developed by Erik van Bokland, which is called TypeCooker. And I think that you can try it at home because it's safe and a lot of fun. So one of my recipes required to use only straight lines in my sketch. So I made this unimpressive sketch, which I'm showing here for historical accuracy only. And like many newbie designers, I found the challenge to render good, or let's say traditional letter shapes with some contrast modulation under such Spartan conditions, very promising and attractive. So when the time for a final TypeMedia project came, I started to sketch more angular shapes, which were supposed to retain some contrast modulation, like thick and thin strokes. And I also learned how other designers like Preissig and Menhard played that game. But my own sketches didn't satisfy me for a long time until I realized that drawing a satisfying letter shape using only straight lines is much easier if the letter is narrow. That way you can, you need less straight segments to represent a curve, and you can also avoid these long, horizontal, boring stretches. So I always loved condensed typefaces, and I enthusiastically decided to work on a typeface that works best when it's condensed, which construction works best when the letters are narrow. And of course, I was also influenced by the environment. I lived in the Netherlands, and that is a country full of tall people and narrow houses, so that must have been a reason as well. And looking for the right weights for my type family, I bumped into a problem well known among experienced type designers, and it's the letter can't keep gaining weight while staying condensed. At some point you will have to choose whether your letter is condensed or heavy. So in other words, the heavier the heaviest style become, the less condensed it is. The lighter style, in turn, can become thinner and more condensed until it just disappears. That's how I ended up with a moderately narrow light style and relatively light black style, if you follow me. And Pilot's 5 final weights and corresponding italics are an optimal set of styles to combine with each other, especially if you skip a style in between. Pilot is definitely not a revival. It doesn't have a link to a specific historical example. But in the very early stages of my work on Pilot, I realized that the letter forms I was working on reminded me on a certain genre from a certain time. And these kinds of publications actually inspired me, not directly by their typography, but rather by their general appearance. For example, that Space Cat on Mushrooms was very inspiring, and I'm sure you will share my admiration. So, I've always had crush on futures seen from the past, like utopias, dystopias, all kind of sci-fi, and the future it represents is usually just a twisted version of the present when it was written. And that's what I love about it. So I think that Pilot is actually coming from that non-existent imaginary future described a long time ago. So I entertained myself by placing Pilot in its natural habitat, and I was amazed how naturally, authentically it looks there. So you know, the future is seen from the past, sometimes the past seen from the future. That's very much about my typeface, and I had to pay special attention to the words science and space, so they look good set in Pilot. This is a fake retrofuturistic pulp, typopulp. In 2013, Pilot won first prize in an international competition organized by Fine Press Book Association. And as part of the prize, Pilot Black Italic was cast in metal. Well, just capitals, numbers, and some punctuation. And I see a certain irony in there. So a typeface which was created in the 21st century and was inspired by the 23rd century, described in the 20th century, was cast in metal with the help of the 19th century technology. The process of turning the digital font into metal type was led by Ed Ryer of Swamp Press, and the process involved a Benton pantographer, matrix fitting machine, matrix trimmer, Thomson caster, and many other procedures and specific tools that I don't remember anymore. So first, a photopolymer plate was used to get a relief of the letter form, which is called a pattern. And then Ed followed the pattern with a Benton pantograph to get a much smaller matrix. On the left, there is a pantograph, and the set of matrices are on the right. And finally, a Thomson caster was used to cast the letters. On the right, you see the matrix holder. And it was quite tricky for Ed, because he was challenged by very tight fit of some characters. So in addition to his usual routine, he had to follow some additional tedious procedures. And the metal type is for sale, and I know quite a few designers who bought a set, but so far I only know one designer who is actually printing with metal Pilot, and it's Russell Merritt of Fine Press Book Association, who actually organized that competition, so I think it's not a coincidence. He's printing with Pilot intensely, and I'm very happy to see Pilot being used in such a nice way. Also, it's a great proof that Pilot can do more than just trashy sci-fi pulp fiction. This is a broadside for the deluxe edition of Parenthesis 21. It's a semi-annual journal of Fine Press Book Association. And I must say it's really a deluxe quality print. When I received my copy, I spent quite some time with the magnifier enjoying the sharpness of the letters and the deep black. You know, it's quite common among type designers to make so-called revivals in other worlds, to digitize some obscure typefaces from the metal typesetting era. And to do that, you need a good, sharp specimen, like this one. So I have that obscure idea of digitizing my own typeface, which was cast in metal, and that way to close that loop. And I also got a set of metal Pilot, and I used it once, and it was lots of fun, and it was a very valuable experience and result. There was some results, but it was mostly valuable experience, I must say. So if you're interested in something down to earth, please contact Ed. He will produce a set for you, but it will take a while. But of course, the metal type cannot compete with what OpenType offers. A really cool thing about Pilot is its underlined small caps feature. It works as a stylistic set, and it turns on a double underline for regular and light styles and a solid underline for the rest of the styles. And I designed the underlined small caps in the height of the capitals so they can work nicely together. As you can see, this feature is working well with the elements that descend below the baseline, like diacritical marks, punctuation, miscellaneous characters, and so on. And I'm mostly happy about diacritical marks in this context, because those guys, I bet they killed many type designers' dreams, you know, that's just, yeah. So to make it all possible, there were 9 underlined versions of each character needed. And when I realized what time it will take me to produce or design them all, I was ready to give up. But luckily, Just van Rossum came to the rescue with a few lines of code, as they call it, and he wrote a script that would generate not only the underlined alternates, but also the OpenType groups and the feature itself. So I was rescued by that. And just so you see the scale, the green characters are the underlined versions. So I'm afraid that feature will not be available in metal type for a while. Since Pilot is a compact typeface with tight spacing, I added a few contextual alternates which would fix some annoying clashes as well. This contextual alternate would also enable even tighter setting of some tricky letter combinations. And the flag of the lowercase f caused most of the problems. Again, diacritical marks to blame. I think a wiser, a more experienced type designer might have went for a less outstanding flag, but that was one of my darlings that I refused to kill at any cost. So I ended up with just 4 alternates for F and FF ligatures to fit with all the possible letters that can follow the letter F. And even though everything ended up well with this guy, I pretty much, it's the most redrawn character of the whole typeface. I redrew it pretty much every time when I opened the font editor. And a similar story happened to my funky G, because I had to accommodate all the accents on top of it, so I had to adjust that ear several times. And after all these adjustments on top of other adjustments, I learned that thinking about the letters with the diacritical marks early in the design process might save some time. these characters with diacritical marks, they're not just derivatives from their parents. They influence the basic Latin letters as much as the basic Latin letters influence them. And I had to pay for that wisdom with sweat and time. And, yeah. Altogether, diacritical marks have quite a burdensome appearance. They stick out, they clash. In the era of metal typesetting, these little details tended to break off or to wear out very soon. In all times, diacritical marks, conventional diacritical marks, prevented tight leading, even if text was set in all caps. And if letters have to be produced as physical objects, the diacritical marks have to be attached somehow. So, very problematic. And I'm sure that most people here are very well familiar with those diacritics related problems, because there are many in Turkish alphabet, like tricky accents. It's must be familiar for you. So Latvian diacritics, in turn, are not the most challenging ones in terms of typography, but nevertheless, for most of my life, I'm from Latvia, I'm observing the attempt to make diacritical marks more compact. On the left, you see the original Georg Seifert's typeface Graublau slab, and on the right, you see how a local Latvian designer scaled and squeezed that comma accent to fit it better in the letter K. This is an advertising campaign for a big drugstore chain. And this is one of my favorites from 90s. Just in case, the macron usually goes on top of the E, but stone is stone, and so it ended up as a very tight décolleté. A historic example. So it's very tempting to place macron not on top of the capital I, capital A, but on a side, because there is a lot of white space, and why would one waste it if one could place a diacritical mark there? More of this kind, beginning of the 20th century. This one is a relatively recent one from Soviet times, 50s, I assume. And 100 years ago, a Latvian graphic artist, Julijs Madrnieks, dealt with the diacritical marks in a radical way. He just placed all the accent inside the letters. Well, it's hardly readable anyway, so will not hurt. I marked them red for you. And Julijs Madrnieks constructed tons of such inspired, of such weird letters inspired by folk ornaments, Latvian folk ornaments. And in general, in the last century, designers took more liberties when working with diacritical marks. So why not to put the comma accent on top of the horizontal stroke of the capital letter L, and that way you can place a nice image right underneath your baseline. So how come that these cumbersome additions to the letters ended up in so many European orthographies? Obviously, there is a different story for every language, but the circumstances under which these particular diacritical marks were implemented in the Latvian language can serve as a thrilling example of socio-political events directly shaping the letters. The story of Latvian diacritics has lots in common with other European nations which experienced the awakening of their national consciousness at the turn of the 20th century. From the 16th to 18th century, written Latvian took shape under very strong strong German influence. This influence is determined by the fact that since 13th century, the territory of Latvia was colonized by German crusaders and missionaries. And local population was slowly relegated to a very subordinate position. Basically, they became serfs, agricultural slaves. And Germans, in turn, became a land-owning and therefore ruling elite. Predictably, the first Latvian texts were printed by Baltic German priests. They patched up German orthography to serve the needs of the Latvian language, but not always successfully, because some peculiarities, some peculiar sounds of the Latvian language were just ignored. That's what written Latvian looked like for most of its existence. So it was set in black letter. The orthography was heavily based on the German orthography, and for the sounds that were impossible to represent in accordance by the means of the German orthography, the peculiar slashed letters were used, as well as some uncertain circumflex accents. So the German orthography dealt with the hissing and hashing consonants like sh, zh, ch, by using 3 or 4 letters to represent them. But the problem is that those sounds are much more frequent in Latvian than in German. Also, in accordance with the German orthography, long vowels in the middle of the word, which are crucial in the Latvian language, they were represented by a silent H following them. That way, a Latvian word could easily contain several monstrous letter clusters that were meant to represent just one sound. Also, some Latvian sounds were so unfamiliar to the German orthography that one couldn't think of a letter combination to adequately represent it in writing. In those cases, special slashed letters were used. German called that slash Virgil, and it was used in early orthographies of several Eastern European languages, like Polish and Lithuanian. And in Polish, you might know they still have an L with a slash. That's a legacy from those times. And because of those slashed letters, and especially when they were double, Latvian text set in black letter looked quite fluffy, I would say, which didn't improve the readability, I'm sure. And there were some shy attempts to use diacritical marks for the long vowels at the end of the word, but obviously they were not always available in black letter fonts, so one had to improvise. So, nevertheless, in the 17th and in the 18th centuries, Baltic Germans did a truly great job developing and systematizing Latvian language and grammar and orthography, and collecting Latvian folklore, and overall reflecting the mood of the Enlightenment era. And it's very pity that Latvians themselves couldn't really appreciate that effort, as they were too busy working in the fields and too busy working as serfs, being slaves. So even though administratively Latvia was part of the Russian Empire since the 18th century, Baltic Germans stayed in charge for most political, economical, cultural events happening in the territory of Latvia. And that included, of course, Latvian orthography as well. The situation gradually changed in the 19th century. The serfdom was abolished in the Russian Empire, and Latvian serfs, Latvian farmers could move to the cities, settle down there, and they did so, and they started to conduct businesses, and sometimes they were successful. So their kids could get an education. And that way, a new class of Latvian intelligentsia arose, and being educated didn't mean anymore to be Germanized as it was for centuries. So young, educated Latvians expressed a desire to continue developing their own language and orthography by themselves. But that desire wasn't easily accepted by the Baltic Germans, who for centuries literally perceived themselves as only guardians of the Latvian language and culture. So Latvian intelligentsia started to perceive black letter fonts as something extremely conservative, something very German. And trying to free themselves from that patronage from Germans, progressive Latvians successfully promoted the use of Roman type for Latvian text. So the alphabet books for kids sometimes would be printed in both faces in the late 19th century. So gradually, Latvians were getting more influence on cultural and political processes happening in what we know as Latvia today. And the orthography reform became inevitable, and its possibilities were passionately debated in the Latvian press. And those temperamental discussions culminated in 1908 with an article in the Latvian Democratic newspaper. This article introduced the orthography reform project and invited all interested people to fill in a questionnaire about their preferences, how Latvian should look in writing. And the article was printed in Roman letters with a new orthography applied to the text, while the rest of the newspaper was still printed in black letter. And here's a close-up of the last paragraph where the authors warned their readers that letters with macron weren't yet provided to the printing house, and there were not enough letters with a caron, so sometimes they were replaced by letters with a cedilla underneath. And on June 17, 1908, the Orthography Commission that was in the meantime formed by Latvians cast a convincing vote for the new orthography. The reform introduced the C, S, and Z with caron on top, replacing previously used letter clusters. The macron from now on would indicate all the long vowels, and the good old slash letters would be replaced by the letters with a comma accent underneath. So now, alphabet books for kids were featuring not only Roman and black letter faces, but also new and old orthography, so 4 options for kids, because children could bump into any of those writings in their life. So even though Latvians agreed among each other about their new orthography, the printers didn't hurry up to replace their black letter fonts with Roman types because it was quite an investment. But in the next 10 years after the reform, everyone in Latvia was slightly distracted from the important orthography issues by the First World War. And as a result of the war, Latvia lost half of its inhabitants. The territory of Latvia was devastated, and farming and infrastructure were damaged dramatically. Looking on the bright side, Latvia declared its independence in 1918, and it became clear that most of the black letter fonts were cast into bullets during the war. That helped the transition from black letter to Roman fonts. In 1922, the Prime Minister of Latvia signed the decree about orthography reform, which prescribed all the governmental and municipal institutions as well as schools to use the new orthography. So it became even more official. And that could be a happy end. Latvia got its independence, and Latvia got its independent orthography, which was developed and approved by Latvians. And the battles probably, the diacritical battles probably were left behind in the 20th century. But would that it were so simple. More diacritical fights. These large letters welcome people as they enter Riga, the capital of Latvia, through its 4 main roads. The letters were designed and set in 80s, and they became quite an iconic symbol of Riga. Everyone knows them, tourists know them, they're printed on t-shirts, very popular. As you can guess, the story is concerning the macron above the I, which indicates a long vowel. You pronounce it Riga in Latvian, and it's very important. Don't mess with that pronunciation. So here comes the story. For a long time, the position of mayor of Riga was held by Nils Ushakovs. He's of Russian origin, which makes him very popular among Russians that live in Latvia, in Riga in particular, because Russians is a big minority in Latvia. And the same Russian origin makes him rather unpopular among Latvian residents of Riga. So on his initiative, a few years ago, the Macron was replaced by a heart in colors of flag of Riga. So this poor addition to the iconic letters was not only blamed for its aesthetic qualities, but it was actually seen as a sabotage against the Latvian language and Latvian culture. And there was criticism from the public people, and there were some protest actions. And the poster on the photo says, Ushakovs, give Riga its Macron back. It's not Riga here in Cyrillic letters, it's Riga. So the original Macron was placed back. And I don't think that heart was really a political sabotage, but still you can see that diacritics still serve as means of national self-identification. Talking about Cyrillic, the attitude toward this script is not all that welcoming in the whole Baltic regions after the end of the Soviet era. The street signs in Soviet Latvia displayed the street names in Latvian and in Russian. In other words, in Latvian and Cyrillic scripts. In 1991, Latvia regained its independence from the Soviet Union, and the Cyrillic part of the old Soviet street signs were just brutally painted over because Cyrillic letters became a symbol of the Soviet occupation. There are many people of Russian origin in Latvia who grew up biscriptural, like me. I remember myself reading Russian and Latvian, well, in other words, Cyrillic and Latin scripts as soon as I started reading at all. And that became quite an advantage once I seriously got into type design. Having expertise in these two scripts and working on Cyrillic extension for Latin typefaces, I learned what does it mean to translate a typeface from one writing system to another. It's not enough just to mimic the shape language. Cyrillic and Latin scripts came to what they are now in very different ways. Even though there is some overlap in their past, they grew and developed on different soils. They were shaped by different cultures, different people, different historical events. So if a Latin typeface references one of those growth stages that didn't happen to Cyrillic, I have to imagine that missing, non-existing piece of Cyrillic history in order to design an adequate Cyrillic extension. So in 2017, a Dutch type foundry, Bold Monday, invited me to join their team to design Cyrillic extensions for IBM Plex type family. It's IBM's corporate typeface, which is released open source, so everyone can use it for their commercial and non-commercial projects for free. I might be biased, but I think it's an amazing project. This type system is really immense in all directions. It's already covering 6 writing systems, and its list is growing. And I had the honor to design the first script beyond the Latin. There are sans, serif, mono, and sans condensed subfamilies, and each of them includes 8 weights. So Cyrillic was added so far to all the subfamilies except sans condensed. Hopefully that's something to come. The Latin part was developed in close collaboration between Bold Monday's team and IBM Executive Creative Director Mike Ebbing. IBM sees themselves as a medium between human and machine. So the keystone of IBM Plex letter shapes is the balance between the natural and the engineered. Amazingly, it doesn't just sound good, but it's actually visible in every IBM Plex letter. So designing IBM Plex Cyrillic, my main concern was to keep it at the right level of plexness, as Mike Ebbing called it. One of the plexness manifestations was adopted from IBM logo. It's the vertical stroke and the right angle of the interior counters, which contrast against the rounded curves of the exterior stroke. And this little element of IBM Plex Sans references that feature and occurs frequently in the Latin part. It also became one of the biggest Cyrillic challenges. When I drew my first set of Cyrillic basic letters for IBM Plex Sans, it looked approximately like that. It worked just fine in big sizes in running text, but the level of plexness was regrettably low. One of the most characteristic elements, that little stroke, didn't occur in Cyrillic frequently enough. And due to the construction of the Cyrillic graphemes, there were almost no opportunities to add it without making the whole typeface look very eccentric. Before I started to work on Cyrillic, I was shown a sketch Mike Ebbing made for Cyrillic, which I was free to ignore. And it contains this construction for Cyrillic letters K and J. And I was very skeptical about this solution. And indeed, I first just ignored that for a reason I will describe below. Cyrillic K, letter K, could look exactly like the Latin K if there were no Cyrillic letter J, which is graphically closely related to the letter K. And, well, basically it's a mirrored K with some adjustment in the upright styles. So if one uses a Latin K to design a Cyrillic J, the middle of the letter becomes quite complicated and one might say ugly and heavy. So for a long time, such a construction was perceived by Cyrillic designers, mostly Russian designers, as something inexcusable, a sign of an amateur work, which is not the case anymore. But in conventional serif typefaces, Cyrillic K traditionally had a different construction from the Latin K. In Soviet times, those curved branches were taken over to the serifless designs as well. Журнальная рубленная, one of the most widely used Soviet sans typefaces that was based on Erbar Grotesque, contains such branches. One way or another, at the beginning of the computer type design era, Western type designers, as well as some Cyrillic type designers, felt obliged to design Cyrillic letters K and J with those, well, at least with one curved branch, even if they didn't fit naturally with the overall appearance of the typeface. And I cannot tell exactly where that idea came from, but it became one of those commonly known facts, like spinach contains a lot of iron, and Cyrillic letters K and J should contain at least one curved branch. But in the last years, these curved branches are seen as something very archaic. Most Cyrillic designers solved the K and J with a horizontal bridge in serifless designs. So that's why at first I was so reluctant even to consider these shapes for IBM Plex Cyrillic. They just had that out of fashion feel to me. But in the light of the critical deficiency of those elements in Cyrillic, and taking into account that this was pretty much the only valid option to fill that deficiency, I had to review that construction. And all of a sudden, in the context of the other letters, I found them looking quite fresh, even hip. And Cyrillic letter Ya, which looks like reversed Latin R, is also related to Cyrillic K and J, so it got that flip as well. Another Plexness details in the Sun style is this thin joints, these thin bridges. Again, construction of the Cyrillic script doesn't give too many opportunities to implement these characteristic details. It's very much like a fence. There are so I had to look for a way to sneak that thin connection to a few more letters. And most modern Cyrillic sans serif typefaces feature this kind of Cyrillic letter F construction, like Greek theta. The round shape is flowing continuously through the stem, and such a design is common since 1980s. A construction with two ears today is perceived as something that is left for serif typefaces with an expansion contrast, and it's also seen as something a bit archaic. But I had a good reason to implement such a shape in an IBM Plex sans, because it gave me 4 thin joints, and that somehow, so it granted Cyrillic an additional characteristic Plex detail, and also a certain level of eccentricity. So that's how IBM Plex Cyrillic sans ended up with one more archaic letter, which looks cool in the context, in the contemporary context of other letters. The process of designing Cyrillics for IBM Plex serif was slightly less tense because some characteristics of that style made it quite a comfortable environment for Cyrillic. The vertical contrast axis and the ability to use plenty of the bold terminals, they are all very natural for Cyrillic. So it was less about searching for the only working solution, but rather about choosing the best option among the good ones. Like the same letters K and J went through some iterations before we settled down, but these differences influenced the overall appearance of the typeface less than in the case of the sans. The most thrilling and the most difficult part was designing Cyrillic for IBM Plex Mono. Generally speaking, Cyrillic and monospaced is a tricky combination. There are more wide letters with 3 vertical stems in Cyrillic than in Latin. Obviously, these are the most difficult, problematic characters when you have to fit every letter in the same fixed width. And there are plenty of such letters in Cyrillic. And also there is a letter sh. It's the last in the 3rd row, which contains like 3.5 vertical stems. And the situation is getting especially tense in case of heavier weights, as the stems, the width stays the same and the stems are getting thicker, and there's very little counter space left. So one can make the vertical stems thinner in those difficult letters, but one just have to count with an even texture anyway. And I know some Russian type designers who out of principle refused to design a Cyrillic extension for their mono typeface because the Cyrillic part will inevitably look worse. That's a statement, but knowing that the result won't be impeccable anyway gives me certain freedom in my mind. So italic of IBM Plex Mono, in my opinion, is the coolest and the weirdest style of the whole family. In Latin, its cursiveness is really extreme and quite unexpected for a monospaced typeface. If you look at those, for example, X and Z and I, the inspiration for such an expressive tone was an interchangeable typeface called Italic 12, which was used in the golf balls of the iconic IBM's electric typewriter. It didn't exist for Cyrillic, so I had to figure out how it might have looked like if. So applying some alternative history here. So in order to make Cyrillic as eccentric as a Latin, some letters got a pretty much unparalleled shape for a Cyrillic monospaced typeface. This tilde-like descending elements in Cyrillic letters ts and sh are perfectly readable for the Cyrillic readers, but they are mostly known in the context of the archaic serif typefaces. Nevertheless, they work just fine in IBM Plex Mono Italic, both stylistically and technically, since these elements can afford to be well pronounced using the vertical space in circumstances where the horizontal space is very limited. So the only downside is that these guys can evolve and start scrolling if you don't look, so be careful with your breeding grounds for letters. Same goes for the Cyrillic F and a hard sign that's on the right. The shapes in a monospace typeface are unusual but very natural at the same time. To finish my panegyric to IBM Plex, there is a fancy website about IBM Plex type family. There is a list of my wonderful colleagues from all over the world who worked on this project, and this is also a nice demonstration why I love condensed typefaces, because I have a very long name and it always sticks out, so you know, that's another reason for me. And by the way, I also designed a Greek extension for IBM Plex Sense, but that is a story I will tell next time, so thank you.